Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining this live town hall discussion on tribal health issues during the pandemic. This town hall is hosted by Congressman Heck of Washington's 10th Congressional District. We are thrilled to be joined tonight by Abigail Echohawk, Director of the Urban Indian Health Institute and the Chief Research Officer at the Seattle Indian Health Board. We've been collecting questions through social media and constituent mail, and we'll be using those questions to drive this discussion. If you're watching this live on Facebook and have a question, please ask it in the comments section of this video, and we'll answer some of the questions from live viewers. Before we get to questions, I'm going to hand it over to Congressman Heck and then Ms. Echohawk for some opening remarks. Congressman Heck.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you all for joining us. This is, I believe, the 11th in a series of episodes we've had in conversations with people about how it is that we're responding to the COVID-19 virus. Before I get into the conversation with Abigail, whom I am very, very gratified that she would give of her time to join us. She has so much to offer and so much expertise in this regard. I first, however, want to make a couple of comments and observations about the tragic events of our nation over the last week. So my perspective, to put this in context, is that every one of us, those of you watching and myself, especially those of us in public office, have an almost sacred obligation to stand up and speak out and advocate on behalf of the vulnerable and those of lesser means, and those who have traditionally been the subject of social and economic and racial discrimination. And nowhere was that more painfully brought to light than the murder of George Floyd last week. But the truth is, as we all know, George just joined a very long list of people who have been murdered or whose life have been taken under questionable circumstances at best. Eric Garner and Trayvon Martin and Breonna Taylor. The list goes on and on and on, and has for decades and indeed centuries in this country. This weekend, I was reflecting a little on Dr. Martin Luther King's famous statement that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. But I kept thinking over and over in my mind, it ain't bending fast enough, and it isn't. The reality is that these issues, these problems are systemic, that of social and economic and racial injustice and discrimination. And that means that our solutions are going to have to be systemic as well. But it can't even get to that point until we all acknowledge that this is structural. These are the legacies of a continuing and insidious form of discrimination and injustice in this society. That's where this conversation has to begin. And indeed, it's not completely unrelated to tonight's topic, because the reality is when we look at the incidence of the COVID-19 and Indian country throughout our country, you will see, and I'm sure Abigail could help expand upon, amplify upon, the fact that its effects are being felt disproportionately. And that too is a symptom of a broader circumstance of lack of access to adequate health care and all manner of social determinants that lead to this. But I just wanted to share that with you before we began this conversation. And now, Abigail, if you have some opening remarks you'd like to make before we get into our conversation, the floor is yours, my friend. And thank you again very much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me and for having this really important conversation. And I deeply appreciate you starting with the acknowledgement of the pain and the grief that is going on, not only in the African American community, but in this nation as a whole, as the highlight of what is happening to our African American brothers and sisters is being highlighted. And I just wanted to start by I thought a statement that was put out by some of the leading Native organizations, Illuminative, the Indian Collective, and the Native Organizers Alliance was a beautiful one that really talks about the Indigenous solidarity we have with the Black community during this time. So I'm just going to read their statement and use it as my own with their permission. As thousands of people respond to the murder of George Floyd with mass protests and demonstrations across the country, we stand with our brothers and sisters in the Black community. We recognize and share their pain, grief, and outrage. Systematic racism was the engine that built this country. And today, Black, Brown, immigrant, and Indigenous communities are still under attack, and the status quo continues to be nurtured and encouraged by inaction of officials and by the direct words of the president. We call for strong leadership, we demand action from our representatives, and we encourage nonviolent, powerful protests that stand for justice and show that we are all related. And I think our conversation today, and I thank you, Congressman Heck, for taking that stand we're asking our officials to do and acknowledging that this injustice of police brutality can no longer continue. And myself as a public health professional, serving American Indian Alaska Native people, in 2018, the American Association of Public Health actually put out 10 action steps that they would like to see jurisdictions do to end police violence very specifically. And they have urged state legislative bodies to eliminate legislative provisions that shield law enforcement officers from investigation and accountability, and to reverse the militarization of law enforcement. And we urge, and this is something I'm very dedicated to, we definitely urge federal agencies, local jurisdictions, and states to add death or injury by legal police intervention to their list of reportable conditions of death in the CDC. And what that means is right now, those deaths by police brutality are not being captured in the way that they should in the federal reporting data systems. And that lack of data is very important. And so I just want to say that we stand with our Black brothers and sisters, that the Indigenous community is in solidarity with them, and we stand with them as they fight to ensure the safety and the well-being of their people.
Thank you, Abigail. And thank you for mentioning the issue about data collection, because I'm suspecting that, and I am hoping that we're going to get into a little bit about data collection as it relates to reporting on health conditions in general, but specifically COVID, and what mechanisms and structures we have to make sure that we are getting a high fidelity look at what's happening. But let's start with the basic premise here, which is what is happening throughout Indian country as it relates to the COVID virus. And as the data suggests, in some places where the incident is disproportionately higher, in some cases, hundreds of times higher. And I'm using that term very specifically, very advisedly. There are some tribes whose incident of the virus is hundreds of times higher than in the rest of the population. But just generally, Abigail, could you please characterize what is happening in Indian country with respect to COVID-19 and why?
Absolutely. So one of the things I first wanted to define for your audience of folks is when we say Indian country, I'm going to be speaking about that really broadly. So anywhere Native American people live, eat, work, pray, all of the things we do as incredible communities. And there are those of our relatives who are currently living on tribal lands, which are reservations and villages across the United States. And approximately 70% of all American Indians and Alaska Natives currently live in large urban settings, like the city I'm in today. My office is located in Seattle, Washington. And
Abigail, can I interrupt to get some context clarity for people? As I recall, there's something like 600 recognized tribes. Can you recall, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but can you recall what percent of members live on reservations versus off? Number one. And number two, I think you should talk a little bit about what your job is there to help people understand this idea that so many Native Americans live off reservations and are in need of these services that you all are a part of. So,
absolutely.
Population split and your job. I apologize for interrupting.
No problem. That really helps actually to help clarify for folks. So currently there are 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States. In addition to that, there are state recognized tribes and unrecognized tribes that we recognize as Native people as being tribal people. The federal recognition, as I'm saying it, literally means they were approved by the federal government. And we know that there are some state tribes and other unrecognized tribes that were here and that are thriving communities. There are a variety of reasons as to why the population split is the way that it is right now. So right now, as I said, approximately 70% of all American Indians and Alaska Natives live in large urban settings like Seattle. The rest of the folks live in rural areas, some of them on reservation and some of them off reservation. And there's a variety of reasons for that. There was a federal government program that actually worked to relocate and terminate tribal ties by taking Native people off the reservations and putting them in large cities. Seattle was one of those areas, which is why we have one of the largest and incredible thriving urban Indian community here. Other folks leave the reservations for economic reasons, to achieve education, and for other socioeconomic reasons. And many of them, like myself, I live in the city of Seattle. I am a citizen of the Pawnee Nation of Oklahoma on my father's side, and on my mother's side, I belong to the village of Mintasa Lake, Alaska. I am fortunate to be able to go back and forth, and many of our people do that. They go back and forth between the large cities, smaller cities, and they go back and forth to their homes, wherever their tribes may be. And so our people are migratory still to this day, moving on and off reservation into large cities. And we have created these large, thriving urban Indian communities that work in tandem with our tribal communities that are located on the reservations and the villages. And so as a result of our people being spread across the United States, we have the need to ensure that we're represented in the data. So right now, I'm sitting in the offices of the Seattle Indian Health Board. We are a federally qualified health center located in Seattle, Washington. We serve approximately 7,000 people in the Puget Sound region, and 65% of those folks are American Indian or Alaska Native. And one of the things that we do, which I direct, is our research arm. And I'm the director of an urban Indian organization that looks at data. So I'm a tribal epidemiology center. And I know across the country, people keep hearing epidemiology. I'm not sure everybody knows what it means, but it is a way of tracking disease. So when we think about how COVID-19 has started and where it's going, one of the things that is key to ensuring that we're able to prevent, to intervene, and to understand its impact is through epidemiology. And it's folks like myself who gather data, and we watch the trends of what's happening so that we know where to intervene and we know the impact that it's having on a population of people. So the tribal epidemiology centers, there's 12 of us across the US. The Urban Indian Health Institute is the only one that is national and works with very specifically the urban Indian community. And so we're really fortunate to be able to do that out of Washington State and to work with more than 28 states across the country to do that. And right now, it is more important than ever with the impact of COVID-19 right now in our communities. And we know that there are some communities like the Navajo Nation, which that community is actually in the top 3 of the hot spots of the largest impact of COVID-19 is in the Navajo Nation, which is a very rural tribal community in Arizona and New Mexico, and is seeing some of the highest rates of COVID-19 infections and deaths. And one of the reasons being is that many of our Native people have some of the highest rates of the health disparities and the risk factors for COVID-19. So heart disease, other kinds of lung disease, diabetes, we have some of the highest rates, making our people more at risk for COVID-19. In addition to that, one of the reasons it hits our communities so hard is the socioeconomic status, both in the reservation communities and the urban communities. So we know our people, as a result of the federal policies that have inhibited and suppressed our economic growth, that we have low income communities who live in crowded households. We have some reservations and villages that don't have access to sanitary conditions like running water. So they're not able to have running water to wash their hands, for example. We have hospital systems that are chronically underfunded. So once they have a few cases of COVID, they don't have the ability to treat anymore. And so as a result of these continuing underfunding by the federal government, we are seeing COVID-19 impact both in the rural areas and also in the urban areas in a way that is different than any other community in the United States.
So one of the things you did not mention, however, on that list, Abigail, is an issue that is near and dear to me, which is housing. And inadequate housing is also a factor, I believe, in the spread of COVID-19. As it turns out, especially for those Native Americans who live on the reservation, but I suspect off as well, clarify if you can, the incidence of overcrowding is way higher than it is in the rest of the population. As a consequence, you have more difficult time socially distancing and protecting, especially the elders, but also others. So housing is a factor as well. You mentioned clean water. I've mentioned housing. Are there other factors and you mentioned comorbidity, I think is the term, people who have other healthcare conditions, and you mentioned poverty, but what other kinds of physical factors like lack of lack of clean water and lack of housing?
So the housing is a huge issue, and one that we've always appreciated the work that you've done in Congress to ensure housing for Native people, because not only is it chronically overcrowded, that means there may be 10, 12, 15 people in a double wide trailer, but then you have to think about what are the conditions of that house that they're in, the trailer, the HUD housing, whatever it is very often a lot of even the environment that they're in isn't up to par as to what it should be. And so not only are they overcrowded, but they may not have access. Again, their trailer may not be hooked up to running water. Their home may not have running water. They may not have proper windows. They may not have access to electricity. All of those things are happening right now. And in addition to that, when we think about that, particularly in the rural reservation areas, is that there's also a lack of information on COVID-19. And we know that there is an absolute lack of broadband internet and access to internet in the reservation areas. And so we have folks who don't understand the impact of COVID-19 and why it's so important for them to wear masks, for them to social distance, for them to live out and about, simply because they don't have access to the internet and they're not getting the information, and the information they are getting isn't good information. And so we have organizations across the country trying to reach those folks who not only lack in the housing area, but lack just the basic access to information. And in addition to that, we're trying to make sure that, and there are, again, tribal organizations, including my own across the US, who are adapting materials for our community so that it's said in an understandable way about what it means to social distance and why COVID-19 could have such an impact on our people.
I'm going to digress briefly because you made the reference to broadband internet on reservations. It's generally true of rural areas, but it's also true of some urban areas that people don't have access to affordable broadband internet. I'm going to make the case, frankly, that as the federal government and state government begins to dig its way out of and rebuild this economy, that it is almost inevitable that what will be considered as a major infrastructure investment program, because every recession that we've been in has had Congress and the state legislatures act by building more. And I'm just going to posit, frankly, Abigail, that if we get through this investment in infrastructure, which this nation desperately needs, we are routinely given very poor, in fact, failing grades from the American Society of Civil Engineers for our overall state of infrastructure. If we get through this investment phase and fail to finally realize the extension of broadband internet throughout this country, then it'll be act of the ultimate political negligence. The truth of the matter is, extending broadband to rural areas and other areas that are underserved is the 21st equivalent of electrification from the early 20th century. We simply have to do this because our entire economy is now dependent upon it. I heard an interesting statistic today, namely 90% of Americans now have smartphones. This is not how we just talk with one another, communicate with one another, and recreate. This is how we do business. And the failure to provide adequate broadband throughout Indian country and the rest of rural America and other places that doesn't exist is a crime. We have to remedy it. So just wanted to get that plug in. Thanks for opening the door on that. So what should we do, Abigail? What are the most important things that we can do dealing with this problem going forward?
It goes back to what we had discussed a little bit prior, and it has to do with the data collection. And so one of the things right now that's happening at the federal level, at the state level, and at the counties is that resources that are coming through, things such as the CARES Act that have been passed, those are being distributed based on data. So the policymakers are always being told, make data-driven decisions. However, if the data is faulty, how can you make good decisions? And so we know that with COVID-19 and this first wave that we've experienced, it is all public health folks, all the epidemiology folks, we are predicting a second wave of COVID-19. But in this first wave, we know that data on American Indians and Alaska Natives is absolutely lacking. And not just for our community, but for many communities. So for example, here in Washington State, we know that of the COVID-19 data that the state is reporting out, 30% of all of the data they've put out that has to do with the mortality from COVID-19 and positive COVID-19 tests, 30% of that data has no race or ethnicity attached to it. That means when you look at communities like the American Indian Alaska Native, is folks haven't been gathering the data. And so we can't tell communities who are more at risk, like my community, we can't tell what's happening in the communities based off the data because it hasn't been gathered and it's not being reported. And there's a couple of different reasons for that. It may be that the clinic or hospital simply didn't have the checkbox. That's happened to me quite a few times here, where I've gone into a clinic and I go to check, it says check white, African American, Hispanic, Latino, and there won't be a box for American Indian or Alaska Native. And I'll get in an argument with the person at the front desk about why that's not there, because it directly impacts us being invisible in the data. So I'm in King County, Washington, where Seattle's located, and the King County put out an analysis of the impact on communities of color. But because of the faulty data that has been gathered in the state of Washington, they were unable to talk about the American Indian Alaska Native community because the data hadn't been gathered in a good way. And as a direct result of that, when policymakers have these discussions on where resources should go and public health departments make these decisions, they're kind of guessing on what's happening in the Native community. And that shouldn't be happening. We truly need the data to be gathered in a way that truly represents us. So my organization has put out best practices in data collection for American Indians and Alaska Natives in COVID-19. The resources are there. What we need is strong leadership for folks to say at the state level, the county level, in the public health jurisdictions to recognize that this is wrong, that this needs corrected. And in fact, here in Washington state, the Washington Board of Health is actually considering mandating race and ethnicity reporting for COVID-19 and other infectious disease, which I say is a step that they need to take, and it needs to be taken across this country. When you eliminate it, we're gone.
Who would oppose that? Abigail, who would oppose that and why? That just seems commonsensical for a reason I'm going to get into in a minute.
Yeah, it does seem really common sense. It does right now. I do recognize working in a clinic that our providers and staff are overworked right now. Everybody is working their hardest to do their best. And when the systems aren't set up to collect the data, it takes some time to put the systems in place. So it takes time, it takes staff, and it takes resources. And so we need those resources at those hospital level, clinic level. We need those diverted to ensure that this data collection starts. I don't think anybody has is saying, oh, that's just way too much work. It just seems like right now, there's so much going on, but to me, it's of urgent necessity because it benefits all citizens if that data is collected.
That's the point. So let's parse this a little bit. You can make the case that it's important to collect this data by race or ethnicity, because where there are disproportionate impacts, it will enable you to get the resources to where the need is. And that's a morally good thing inherently. But also because of the nature of a virus, which respects no physical boundaries, the ability to get the resources to where it's being disproportionately felt is a way to protect the broader population as well. It's in everyone's best interest, is it not, to be able to determine if there are concentrations of this to be able to attack the virus so that everyone can be safer. Is there some flaw to my logic that I'm not being aware of?
No, perfect logic. And that's what I keep telling everybody. When you think about the Native community and other disproportionately impacted communities, is we're the folks you sit next to on the bus, where our kids are playing with your kids, we're sitting next to you in a little cubicle. We are your friends, we are your community, and what impacts us impacts you. And the World Health Organization, when they define and they look at the health and well-being of a community, it is really the disproportionate impact on the smallest part of it that impacts the overall health and well-being of the entire community. And so I think exactly what you said, we have to think about when we direct resources in this way, when we direct, policy change in this way, we have to look at it as affecting the entire community, because when we are healthy and whole, so is the rest of the community. And I think one way to really illustrate this is right now with the homeless community. Again, as you know, you've been a strong advocate for housing. We know that Native people in cities across the United States tend to be the most disproportionately impacted by homelessness. In King County, Washington, they're 10 times more likely than their white counterparts to be homeless. And there has been incredible efforts. I can point to King County, Washington, and other places, for example, in LA and other parts of California, where they have had their public health jurisdictions, their mayors, their governors really make sure that there are resources to get homeless individuals at risk for COVID-19, so high risk, and also those who need quarantined and those who have been diagnosed, access to housing, whether it be in hotel rooms or renting out apartment buildings. Is we've actually seen an incredible number of homeless individuals receive housing during this time. And what I don't want to see is it end when people think COVID is over. We really have to see this as a public health intervention, that when you house individuals, you have immediately improved the health and well-being of the community as a whole.
Well, Abigail, you know my mantra: pillow, blanket, roof. If someone doesn't have a pillow to lay their head on at night, a blanket to keep them warm, and a roof over their head, whatever other issue is interfering in their life cannot be successfully dealt with, because people who sleep under bridges can't effectively deal with substance abuse or mental health or the lack of economic opportunity. Housing is very primary, very basic, very foundational. So, Lauren, let's go to some questions that were pre-submitted or have been submitted during this spirited first part of the conversation. If you would, please, Lauren.
Yes, thank you so much. Our first question is coming from constituent mail and was asked by Ben. Does the $8 billion of funding for tribes in the CARES Act include additional COVID-19 related funding for Indian Health Services? $8 billion does not go very far when spread so widely. Congressman Heck?
So each of the bills that we have passed have contained progressive amounts of resources to help us deal with this. And the fact is that the House, after the CARES Act enacted or passed the HEROES Act, it's now sitting in the Senate awaiting, I hope, what will be negotiations to get us to a fifth bill, a fifth package to provide for it. And I can tell you and reflect, I think, a little bit upon the perspective of the members of the House, which is as well as we are having brought forward to us a problem statement about resources or a shortage of resources to deal with this, we have responded in kind. So Ben, whether or not the $8 billion was sufficient, there were additional funds provided in the HEROES Act, and there would be in the one following that as well. I don't believe, for example, however, that even all the $8 billion has yet been distributed. The Treasury Department was a little slow on the uptake of that. I think over half of it has gone out and the rest is scheduled to go out in the not too distant future. But we will continue, Ben, to provide resources to the degree that we have documentation sufficient to meet this challenge, because again, it's important to all of us.
So if I could make a quick comment on that, and again, appreciate all the advocacy in getting those bills passed, is that when we think about the funds that went to the Indian Health Service, again, towards COVID-19, they're doing the best that they can in an underfunded health system and trying to reach those tribal communities with that money. One of the things that we found is that the tribal leadership came together and was working to ensure that urban Indian communities also had access. Another thing that happened with those funds is that there was $24 million that are going to be allocated to the tribal epidemiology centers to support our work in doing this epidemiology for the COVID-19 in tribal communities. But as you said, while that funding did pass, we have not accessed that yet. And that's because it's coming through the Indian Health Service and they haven't figured out the distribution of that. So right now, my team is doing everything that we can with a little bit of resources that we have in order to serve our communities. And I just want to tell a quick story that I'm sure you're aware of. Prior to the passing of those acts, the Seattle Indian Health Board had put in requests both to the state, to the county, and also to the Indian Health Service for personal protection equipment, so PPE. We were running really low. We are a testing site. We have incredible community members who are at high risk, and we are running low on PPE. And so we got what we thought was PPE, and when our facility staff opened up the box of what we thought was going to be equipment for our staff and doctors. Instead, in that box, it was a box of body bags. And we were sent a box of body bags before we received our PPE equipment. And to this day, we actually don't know who sent that to us. The county says it wasn't them. We haven't gotten an answer anywhere else. Somewhere from this system, body bags were sent to us. And so before we received the CARES Act funding and before we even received our shipment, which we did get from the Indian Health Service, a community member here, 8th generation, which is owned and operated by the Snoqualmie tribe, they donated PPE and more than 10,000 masks to the Seattle Indian Health Board. And we're so fortunate that our community stepped up. And without them, we would have been lacking. And so this funding that we got, the $8 billion, whoever asked the question is right. It's not a lot of money. It's not going to go real far, but it was necessary and it was needed. And we're going to continue to advocate for funds like that to ensure, and for me, it's a metaphor, the body bags. In Indian country, we're doing everything we can to keep our people from dying, and we shouldn't have to do that. We should be doing everything we could to ensure their health and well-being. And so the body bags are almost a metaphor for what we've been experiencing. And I don't want body bags. I want medical equipment, I want medical resources, and I want what our community needs in order to stay healthy, well, and whole.
Good. We will work with you on that for sure, Abigail. That incident that you referred to of the body bags was so macabre that it actually was the object of national press attention, and understandably so. It's just so bizarre. Lauren, further questions?
Thank you both. Our next question comes from Jennifer and was asked on Facebook. Why are states allowed to do what they want with COVID funding, but tribes have strict rules, including that they cannot share funding with tribal members, and that if the rules are not followed, tribes will have to pay the money back? Congressman Heck?
Well, Jennifer, thanks very much for the question. I'm going to admit that I'm not quite certain to which you're referring, because the fact is the tribes are operating under the same rules as the state government is in terms of the distribution of that. Now, there may be an explanation for this in the following, and I don't know, but I know that the states can't distribute to individuals either, same set of rules. Early on, states and tribal governments were only allowed to use the funding for specific expenses specifically associated with the COVID-19 virus. And of course, what local and state governments and tribal governments were understandably saying, and legitimately so, is our revenues have disappeared. We need those funds to supplant our lost revenue. Because remember, they're providing all sorts of the valuable services to vulnerable populations, which we would call social determinants of otherwise health and well-being. So the very conditions which may lead to the spread of COVID or help mitigate its severity were at extreme risk of being reduced. And so they were saying, let us replace our revenues, give us aid to replace our revenues. And of course, that's exactly what Congress did subsequently. The HEROES Act itself contains, and this is a ridiculously high or large sounding number, but even it isn't sufficient to the problem, $1 trillion for local and state governments. And tribes had some carve outs for that, what we call carve outs, money set aside for tribes to replace revenue. Now, that's all in addition to the other kinds of programs that were available. It's on top of the unemployment compensation benefit. It's on top of the PPP program through the Small Business Administration. It's on top of the EIDL program through the Small Business Administration, all these different pots of money that were sent out. This was basically funds to replace lost revenue, which we hope the Senate will get to enacting. But Jennifer, as it relates to the question of tribes having more restrictions on getting money to tribal members and citizens, I don't believe that's at all true.
Thank you, Congressman. Our next comment comes from Melissa and was submitted through constituent mail. The first round of SBA loans has entirely left out the casinos. The tribal governments usually do not have the authority to tax to bring in revenue to run their government services. Without access to SBA loans, the tribal casinos could fold, leaving community members jobless. More importantly, the tribal governments won't be able to provide certain critical government services. I would like you to find a way for the law to be changed to include access for tribal casinos to the SBA loans. Congressman Heck, would you like to comment?
Well, she's exactly right. In the first round, those loans weren't available to casinos, but they weren't available because of a 25-year-old law that said any entity that had, I think, more than a third of its revenue for gaming purposes would be ineligible. And subsequent legislation we've passed, we've corrected that for casinos up to a certain size. You have to not exceed a certain employment level. And she's absolutely, excuse me, she's absolutely right. The basic functioning of tribal government services to principally vulnerable members is funded in no small part on gaming revenues. And those revenues didn't decline, those revenues disappeared. They just fell off the table when the casinos were closed. Now, the encouraging part is that we're beginning to see casinos opening up. Tribes are exercising some very strong measures to make this as safe as possible. They've installed plastic shields between machines. They've required people to be X number of machines apart. They're requiring masks and all the kinds of things that public health officials are recommending. And that's happening last week and this week and next week. And we will hope that that is able to be done on a very safe basis. First of all, in accordance with all those procedures and protocols that are being adopted, and that the revenues will return so that the services that the tribal governments provide can be kept as whole as is possible. You know, it begs a question, however, I think, about the issue of the status of the relationship between tribes and the federal government. And Abigail, as somebody who's here now with us, I would like to ask you to describe this a little bit. A lot of people don't understand that the federal government has a trust relationship and responsibility for tribes. A lot of people don't understand that tribes, when they are federally recognized, are sovereign nations. And they have a hard time getting their mind around those two concepts if they've not been exposed to it. I'd like you, if you wouldn't mind, for those people who are watching that don't have much background in issues relating to Indian country, to discuss the federal government's trust responsibility and the nature of the tribe's sovereignty. Is that okay? Would you be willing to do that?
Absolutely. And I think it's a really important one to think about right now. Again, being here in Washington State, we know that the tribal enterprise, I believe it's the fourth largest employer in Washington State. And I know that rings true across many other states where, in particular, these casino enterprises and economic enterprises that follow after those are a huge part of the overall community, and they're incredibly important. And the relationship that they have with their tribal members and the government is important. So, like I said, I'm a citizen of the Pawnee Nation of Oklahoma, and I say citizen very specifically in that I am an enrolled member. And what that means is that under the treaty of my tribe, under our treaty, we are recognized as a sovereign nation within the state of Oklahoma. So we were moved from Nebraska and Kansas when we signed our treaty in 1876, and we were relocated into the Oklahoma territories. When my tribe signed that treaty, there were certain things within that treaty that were included. It included access, for example, to quality health care. It included access to ensuring that we received education, and many other things. And that treaty established us as a sovereign nation, as a tribe, as an entity that has a government to government relationship with the United States federal government. So for example, you can think about the Pawnee Nation as Sweden, another country that has its own government, has its own way of doing things, that comes into relationship with the United States sometimes, as do other countries. And in that relationship, there are certain negotiations that may happen. So negotiations in many states around the way that gaming happens, for example, in their gaming compacts. And they have this government to government relationship. And then when we go to the federal trust responsibility, that is as a Native person who is a citizen of a federally recognized tribe, the federal government has a responsibility to what they call domestic sovereign nation tribes within the United States, this federal trust responsibility that fulfills the treaty rights that I have as an enrolled citizen of the Pawnee Nation of Oklahoma. And you may notice I'm not in Oklahoma because I keep talking about Washington. That federal trust responsibility did not end because I stepped off the Pawnee Reservation. That federal trust responsibility is still belongs to me as an enrolled citizen of the Pawnee Nation of Oklahoma. And so I participate in my tribe's elections, which I'm doing right now. We're about to have an election right now. And I participate in my tribe's overall health and well-being, as do many other tribal members. And these are legal responsibilities that the federal government has to tribal communities. And that's what makes us very unique. Very often we have to think about ourselves, and we are, as Native people, a political entity instead of just a race or ethnicity as compared to other race and ethnicities across the United States. And that federal trust responsibility is the way that our tribal leadership works with members of Congress and works with their states and their counties to ensure that they are represented. And we are constantly always pushing and advocating for that we need to hold that federal trust responsibility, and it needs to be met. So for example, the CARES Act and the funding that flows to the tribes, that is part of the federal trust responsibility that the government has to ensure the tribes get access to the resources they need to have in order to serve their people. And I was very fortunate to be able to participate in some of the calls where tribal leadership was working on the language for the tribes in the CARES Act. And I know one of the things they consistently advocated for was open and flexible funding. And so for those folks out there who belong to tribal communities, continue to advocate for that. Have your tribal leadership working with your members of Congress to advocate for open and flexible funding. And when we identify outdated laws, such as the congressman just spoke about, there's opportunities for us to change those laws as we identify those that are inhibiting our ability for sovereignty and self-sufficiency.
So when I try to help people understand this notion of sovereignty and what the trust responsibility is, I often find myself telling the story of a discussion, if not an argument, I had with a member of my family. This was a few decades ago, and they were expressing a lot of discontent and anger about the fact that in Washington state, the tribes were given by the Bolt decision the right to half the fish that were harvested. But that decision by Judge Bolt was made in accordance with the treaty, the Medicine Creek Treaty that was entered into between the government and the tribes. And the person with whom I was arguing, a family member, said, "Oh, but that was a long time ago," as though that somehow rendered the treaty less applicable today. But here's the deal. Treaties exist in perpetuity, and neither party has the unilateral authority to change the conditions, which I explained to my relative, who did not want to accept that. So finally, the only thing I could think to say in retort was, okay, you want the tribes to give back their right to half the fish. I bet we could talk them into that deal. Give them back all their land, which was, of course, the end of the conversation. What's important for people to understand is treaties exist between the nations, tribal nations, and the US government in perpetuity, and neither gets to change the deal because they don't like it anymore. That's the circumstance that we have. Lauren, do we have other questions? Okay, I told that story, Abigail.
That is a perfect story, and I think again illustrates, people in here in Washington State, there's actually was a bill passed that required education on sovereignty in public schools. And one of the things that is lacking in the educational systems is a basic understanding of who Indigenous peoples in the United States are and our treaty rights. And our treaty rights, like you said, they just don't go away, because otherwise, I love that. I'm going to use that. Give us the land back.
Yeah, it's a deal. You want to undo it? Okay. Lauren, do you have other questions?
Yes, I have one last question for Ms. Echohawk. How has the pandemic impacted the Seattle Indian Health Board and other urban Indian health organizations and your health providers?
So we have seen incredible impact, and we have seen incredible resiliency as a part of that. I'll kind of go back to my own history again, because I've talked about being a member of the Pawnee Nation. When I think back on the impact of pandemics, we have seen that in Native communities since the first colonizers came to the US, and we had smallpox and influenza. And by the census of 1910, the Pawnee people, which were then on the Pawnee Reservation, when they did the census, there was less than 700 of us left. More than 92% of our entire population had died as a result of the wars and a majority, the pandemics that had happened. Our people are survivors of these pandemics. But you have to recognize 92% of my people died. I am a tangible manifestation of my ancestors' resiliency going through those pandemics. And we don't want to see that kind of impact in our community that was seen prior. And we are doing everything we can. So when we look at the tribes and the urban Indian organizations, we have all actively taken steps to ensure that our people are served. Here at the Seattle Indian Health Board, we have incredible screening processes when you come in. We are operating 2 testing sites, one at our clinic, and we are doing one with the homeless population in Pioneer Square in Seattle. And I know if I go to my counterparts of urban Indian organizations in California, they're doing similar things. Our staff have stepped up. They're working overtime, many hours, serving folks, assisting people. And one of the things we've done that we're seeing happen across the United States as a result of a waiver in the HIPAA laws, which protect privacy when you go into a health clinic, for the very first time, clinics across the United States, hospitals across the United States have been able to expand telehealth. And we've done that at Seattle Indian Health Board, and it's happening in all the urban centers across the United States. And that means is we can do, visits that don't require somebody to come in. We can do those over the phone. We can do them over Zoom. We can do them over other ways. And we've never been able to do that to the extent that we're doing it right now. And I really hope that that doesn't go away when they think COVID's gone away, because we've increased the accessibility for many people to access their healthcare in a way that hasn't been done before. And with these changes, we are doing everything we can to protect every individual that comes into our clinic, that works for us, that interacts with us, and that takes an incredible amount of resources. And so we've directed our resources to making sure that we have PPE, that we have all of the testing supplies that we need, because for a long time we didn't. And we're also doing our national advocacy work to ensure that members of Congress are aware of our needs and that they're paying attention, because we do not want our people to be invisible. And for me, my concentration right now is on that data collection. And in fact, I just had some of my team just met with the CDC last week, and we've been pushing for the CDC to recognize our public health authority, which we have, that was included in the 2010 Affordable Health Care Act. Tribal epidemiology centers are public health authorities. And as such, we should have access to any data gathered in the states that is governed under HHS. However, the CDC has not been giving us that data, and that public health authority isn't being recognized in all of the states and all of the counties. And so we are advocating really hard to get access to whatever data is there, and for them to understand that as public health authorities, we have a right to that data under federal law. And so that's one of our areas of advocacy right now. And I would say that sometimes they treat me like I don't know what I'm doing. And I kind of want to say, Google me and take a look at the resources and what our communities do, because we need access to this information, and shifting, whether it be shifting the way that we do the testing to ensuring that we're getting the data, that then we can direct the resources to the correct places within all of our organizations.
Abigail, I want to make a few quick observations and ask for a response on your part. You'll have to correct me if I'm wrong in any of this regard. Most Native American tribes did not have written languages. Instead, what they had was an incredibly powerful oral tradition, oral history tradition. We can't even begin, those of us who do not come from that tradition, begin to relate to how powerful it was. This isn't just a question of grandma and grandpa or the elders telling us stories about what happened on the family farm in South Dakota in the 1920s. This is a way of conveying culture, a way of conveying history in a very deep way. And as a consequence of that, it's a couple of things occur to me. The first of which is that the pain of pandemics being visited upon tribes in history feels a lot more recent to Native Americans than it probably does to the rest of us. I mean, we watch TV with ads and black and white stories about the Spanish influenza epidemic, but when I interact with people in Indian country, what happened 100 years ago to them in many regards was day before yesterday. And it's because their grandparents told them about it in great detail. There wasn't a book that was passed, it was instruction. It was a part of the fabric of who they were. So I wonder if the pain is deeper among Native Americans. I think it is. And number two, I wonder if that explains why, for example, one of the tribes that I have the honor to represent, the Nisquallies, they shut the reservation down altogether because the memory feels so recent. Am I on the right track here, Abigail, or disabuse me if I'm wrong?
I think you definitely are on the right track. And I think about that. So even within my own family, my dad has told me the story. He knew one of the oldest living Pawnees who had walked that trail from Nebraska to Pawnee, and she had also had experienced a pandemic within her family. So I grew up with those stories, and those stories are told to us and they're part of our living history. And so we do have a strong tradition of oral storytelling. In addition to that, many of these traumas that have been perpetuated as a result of the colonization of this country and the impact on Indigenous peoples is what we call historical trauma. So historical trauma, the science of it evolved actually out of looking at the impacts of the health and well-being of Holocaust survivors' families. And they found that, great grandchildren were still experiencing the effects of the trauma of Holocaust survivors. And so it was then studied in Native communities, and we found the same thing, that these traumas that we've experienced have actually changed our DNA. And so there's a science called epigenetics, which looks at the changes within your DNA as a result of trauma. And so part of it is the stories that we know, that we listen to, that we learned from, and then also changes in our DNA. And so, but out of that, to me, is incredible hope. Because if we're able to see in epigenetics a change to our DNA, that means that it can change back. And the stories that are told around the pandemics, and the Nisqually tribe shut down their borders, along with the Makah Nation shut down their borders here in Washington State, is that they learned, because of those stories, they knew the impact and they knew the steps that they had to take that other people around them thought were like over the top, when in fact they knew the steps to take because of the stories from their ancestors. And so I think that other communities could be learning from the Native community on how we've been responding in this pandemic, how we've supported each other, how we have rallied together to ensure policymakers know that what we need, and how our tribes have exercised their sovereignty to protect their people, which if they protect their people, they're protecting the whole community. And so you're right, those stories are told, and we are using them to this day as part of our ancestral knowledge to protect our people.
I'll give you another brief example, Abigail. I happen to be the prime sponsor of a bill to rescind you're hearing this number correctly, 20 medals of honor given to federal troops for the massacre at Wounded Knee Creek. Which was a travesty in and of itself. We're talking about federal troops shooting, fleeing Native American women and children in the back, literally. So we had kind of a big coming out press conference to announce this bill, and we had leaders, significant number of Native American leaders from South Dakota in, including a woman who just turned 100, and her grandmother was there. And for her, she was not slaughtered, but her grandmother was there. And to her, it was, again, the day before yesterday. This wasn't ancient history. We all tend to think of the massacre at Wounded Knee Creek as so long ago. But when you live in the context of a strong oral tradition, time in some ways collapses. Lauren, do we have any questions, or was that indeed the last one?
That was the last one.
Very good. Abigail, I want to give you an opportunity to make any concluding remarks that you might have before I do, but I have to say before, and I will say after, how incredibly grateful I am that you joined us this afternoon.
Well, thank you so much. It's been an honor to be able to be part of this conversation. And this is a really important conversation I wish more members of Congress would have, because it is important to bring visibility to our community. And so you mentioned the Wounded Knee and those medals of honor, which it's hard to even call them a medal of honor when you slaughtered women and children. And I can't believe that they still exist. And one of the things I always think about, I've been to Wounded Knee many times and have done a lot of work out in the Oglala Lakota community, is that every single year there are riders on horses and runners who run. The survivors ran more than 100 miles after the massacre at Wounded Knee, and they retrace their steps in remembrance, and they pray for the resiliency and for the strength of their people. And what I want folks to know about Native people right now is that we are strong, resilient people. It doesn't mean you can keep throwing bad things at us. We are going to fight to ensure that only good comes for our community. But because of our strength and our resiliency and our connection to our culture and to our people, we are a place that other communities can look at to understand what it truly means to have public health. And public health is the health and the well-being of an entire community. So please come to our communities, because not because you think we have the most problems, but because we have the answers. And when you come in partnership, we want to be there to support and to build stronger communities across this country. And in that train of thought, I again want to offer thoughts and prayers for our Black brothers and sisters who are currently fighting for justice within their communities. As Indigenous people, we stand in solidarity with you.
Very well said, Abigail. Again, thank you so much. Your comments about resiliency reminds me of an exhibit that Secretary of State in Washington put on one time, setting forth some of the history of Native Americans in our state. And the title of the exhibit, "We're Still Here." I want to thank each and every one of you again so very much for joining us and giving of us your single most precious commodity, your time, and invite you to join us again. Lauren, pay attention here. We have another conversation coming up. I believe it's the day after tomorrow with Attorney General Bob Ferguson on what his office and the role of the state Attorney General is with respect to protecting people during the time of the COVID-19 crisis. And Lauren, can you explain to us or remind us exactly what time people can tune in for that conversation with Attorney General Ferguson?
Yes, it will be 3:30 p.m. this Friday.
Very good. I hope you'll all be able to join, and I hope you got even a fraction as much out of this conversation with Abigail Echohawk as I did. Abigail, thank you again, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.